I'm making the separate recording as an introduction to the very long, yeah, so where I talk about all the notes that I've accumulated sort of on these topics of South African politics. And I just thought a very good title for this is the only the only viable and valid and even actually successful pathway to transformation is non-racialism and non-sexism as a means, not merely as an end. That you can do whatever the hell you want as long as it supposedly lands up with the description of non-racialism. So you can do whatever you want in the interim. It's not what non-racialism is. Non-racialism is a means and an end. Um, and I guess some of the obvious, sort of problems with the kind of racial politics that we have at the moment, the identity politics, um, and racialism that it's breeding within our society is, effectively when you have someone who, let's say, comes from a black family who is well off, and all the BEE opportunities that exist because of the mandated regulations get given to them, and they have to rationalize this to themselves somehow. They have to say, well, yes, because of history being so evil against my identity, now they're giving me back something in return for that. So somehow they become the sort of the focal touchstone for compensating an identity. They become a token within their own worldview. They become a representative of their identity. They have to believe in the tribalism to make that kind of policy work. They have to believe in this new promulgated racialism that comes straight from the state, empowered by the state authority and enforced by this pervasive new morality of racialism and tribalism, essentially. And, what's worse, I guess, is that if they are then receiving these benefits, and then they also see that, the economy isn't doing well, it's being sabotaged, it's not growing, because effectively, this is the major crime of BEE and things like that, is that it doesn't actually deal with class mobility. It doesn't really uplift people. It kind of, for those who have, they are given even more. And for those who have not jobs, the prospect of getting a job becomes even harder, effectively, because of the destruction and destabilization of everything, to conform to this so-called vision of transformation, which is quite devastating and sabotages everything, because it even sabotages credentials. Because if you are given positions based on government mandates, how do you know that you deserve them? How do you know that you can actually perform the task? How can people trust your credentials? But they never have to trust your credentials because they just want you because of the points that you give them according to the government regulation. And so you have to keep on rationalizing this to yourself. And the only way that you can do that is by adopting this new racialist agenda and this new racialist imagination and consciousness, that everything must become a token of history. Everything must become, so it's this weird sort of excavation of history and projecting it onto the present constantly. And then when the economy isn't doing well, obviously it's not your fault. It's not the state's fault. It's not the government's fault. It's not the policy's fault. It's somehow still, we need to be more radical and we need to be more retributivist and vindictive, and we need to extract more to create more balance, because equality becomes about this statistical balance of representation, that as long as the numbers are somewhat even across the board, that is what equality means, when equality actually means nothing like that. equality, the idea that you're going to keep on looking at people's races and their sex in order to work out if something is even or fair or not, I mean, is really quite obtuse. The idea that people don't have differences, that everyone is interchangeable with everyone else, it's very dehumanizing in a weird kind of way, that the only thing that isn't interchangeable are these categories of race and sex. So it really forces this identity as being the source of your value and your pride. And this is what is also being promulgated by the state. It's very destructive. And obviously it's breeding, it's special form of what I can only call fascistic racialism, and the fascistic worldview of seeing everyone in these tribes. And the so I mean, now obviously I'm not just saying that we should just have a free market. The government is mandated to do something about disadvantage, but because disadvantage has effectively been rewritten as previously disadvantaged, it does all the things that I just complained about, because it doesn't actually make the government do anything proactive directly to tackle disadvantage. It instead just creates these racial benefits and these racialized regulations instead of targeting people because of specific deficits that then get sorted out. And that would be much more specific, it would be much more targeted, and government should actually kind of be in the driving seat of that. It shouldn't pass the buck to private enterprise, although it could potentially pay for what the private enterprise does. But in some sense, the private enterprise doesn't really have the authority, I think, to intervene in such a way. But I mean, all of this racialized politics, it really obscures the problem, because you can't even tackle the real challenges anymore. Because if you do so, you actually cross the red lines according to this racialized ideology. This idea that no, we must all speak all languages equally. We must all, it's these really arbitrary sort of things which have nothing to do with reality. There are certain facts about the world and about, development, which just simply have to be, you can't just say, no, history is evil, so we need to redraw it hypothetically as to what it should have been and create this new so-called transformative world that is imposed from the top down and centrally planned and orchestrated. And this idea between about power imbalances and the imbalance of possession and possessiveness between identities. It's just so toxic. It makes everything unworkable, because every issue gets deconstructed, in which you don't look at practical reality anymore. You don't look at people on the ground, and you don't actually look at the problem, because you only look at how much of the issue echoes something that was a historical injustice, and then you're only working at so-called tackling the historical injustice, and you're not actually looking at targeting disadvantages that exist in the present context. And so because you've got this ideological formula of how to fix things, rather than actually targeting disadvantage and doing something about it, government can, in some sense, never be wrong, because if they fail, it just means that the historical evil is just too powerful and it needs more radical and violent policies to promulgate it. So it can never be wrong. It can never actually be the government's fault. There can never actually be accountability that exists in the present, except from the accountability that is borrowed from history and projected onto the present, which is the overarching narrative, which we get reminded by the so-called Chief Justice. I want to call it, well, I mean, he is the Chief Justice, but I want to rather call him the Chief Unjustice, which I later get into in my recording. Anyway, so I think it is very important to get into the... oh, and maybe I'll be able to edit it out, but there is this section when I'm starting the recording, where there's this, I'm sort of trying to find the file on my phone to start reading from, and there's like a gap of air. There's like a 2 minutes where I'm umming and ahhing, just looking for the thing. But other than that, the whole thing is just contiguous. For the whole duration, I'm just talking after that. So if you just bear with that interruption. But anyway. This is actually a chore for me. I take no pleasure in what I'm about to lay out because it's so... You know, having to put up with somebody else's nihilism and their infantile fascistic worldview that is identity politics is not something, you know, being better, gaslighting, you know, some regressive harbinger of moral degeneration. You know, it's you know, it literally does sort of it does equate to the kind of, you know, so you have an infant that's just sort of screaming its head off hysterically, and obviously you have to attend to the infant, but we're talking about adults. We're you know, so it's that kind of sort of... So much of the ideology is also premised on this kind of this coercive narrative, which you're just incepted into, and then you have to play your role that's designated to you to make the ideological function and to validate it. And okay, anyway, let me get into the substance. So there are a few issues. So there have been a few news stories, and I'm going to go through my notes. Yeah, so I have not prepared this video, but I have, or this recording, but I do have a lot of writing on this topic, so I'm probably going to title this New Thinking on Identity Politics, or New Thinking on South Africa, or something like that, in terms of where we are, which is, you know, and so I've been collecting sort of political diatribes and thinking about things and looking at the news, which is always so depressing. Because it is essentially it's a distraction from actually solving any real problems. It's so we have the Chief Justice in South Africa who has effectively, it's his quest to champion identity politics and betray the Constitution and create and promulgate this new corrupted legal theory that facilitates the kind of moral corruption and state corruption that is pretty much implied. Okay, anyway, I'm just going to now start reading through my things, because the things that I've written are much more... the thesis is stronger, shall I rather say. Let me find the first. Is this the first? No, that's continued. Where's the first one? Must have archived it by mistake. Okay, sorry, I'm going to start soon. Okay, here we go. Uh, yeah. I'm not going to get into the abstract things, but that's the latest thing that I've been thinking about, is how to dissect exactly the kind of confusion that this ideology is premised in. But anyway, I'm just going to get into the kind of sociological incoherence in terms of its sociological analysis and treatment of people, which is just morally is unjustifiable, and for it to be mouthed by the Chief Justice. And I'm going to get into the President's comments as well, because, well, I mean, the Chief Justice is championing this fascistic culture, and the President is sort of trying to play both sides. He's sort of trying to put non-racialist window dressing on, the lipstick on the pig, as it were. Okay, here we go. People do need help. They don't need policy that pretends to solve their problems and only pretends to help them. This pretending, which obscures the truth instead of creating real workable processes and intelligent government interventions, forces company to keep BEE accounting, which means middlemen get paid to create shell corporations to rebrand imports, and stock doesn't get sold because it's overpriced, and the unsustainable business practice weakens the business that followed it. So it can provide overpriced goods to consumers that can redistribute their money towards those middlemen, a system which in the short term will unsustainably profit a few, while corroding the company's trust in those companies with their customers, promoting any competition, so indirectly promoting their competition that doesn't also help and enrich those kinds of middlemen at the expense of their customers. So it's basically a redistribution from consumers or customers to these BEE middlemen, essentially. And, because it can never be done evenly and all at the same time, and even if it was done all at the same time, it wouldn't grow the economy. In fact, it would dampen the economy. It's a complete farce, basically. We need to find ways that lift people up, real opportunities which racialist policy has been destabilizing and sabotaging, which continues in regressing the growth of such opportunities, which are also naturally created in a growing economy. Which also, by the way, when you have a growing economy, produces a larger tax base to fund helpful and effective policies, rather than a zero-sum slash-and-burn approach. We need policies which will enhance people's prospects legitimately by actually lifting them up and equipping them, not policies that mandate that people are treated as if they are equipped with things which they do not possess. Complaining that they have been swindled and robbed because of an unjust history is beyond the point of actually affecting progress. Virtual ideological progress by racialist generalizations enshrined in hideous and unconstitutional legislation to say what should have been the truth can be substituted for the truth that we actually live within is the path of scapegoating an enemy described by the fearful narrative, unwilling to confront the truth that it must that it ends up instead facilitating an invulnerable narcissistic identity that demands violence in response to the possessiveness which it is hypnotized by, as a matrix that convolutes all of life into identities which are controlled by leadership and enforced membership, identities which contain all of morality to the extent even of betraying our supreme constitution. So basically everything has to fit the identity politics mold. Everything has to be reduced into identity to make that method work. Anyway, I will end up repeating this point further on. I would like to say to these so-called identity politics revolutionaries, rather go complete the revolution of your radical love of blackness in Zimbabwe. Or is your ideology actually just a group of radicals who want to be a new aristocracy over the followers of those you sell a story of hate so that you can justify your hold on power, which you do in the name of the identity? When people are selling you a solution to the identity and not a solution to the issues as they are perceived in non-racialism, you have become the bigoted hate mongers of a new apartheid culture, which is at the moment, which is fine at the moment within itself to tolerate, which is fine at the moment to tolerate your scapegoat. Oh, okay. So I'm saying that this culture right now is capable of tolerating the scapegoat of the political rhetoric that comes from this new apartheid culture, so long as they agree to take belonging of the radical visions which the ideology is premised on reacting against. Okay, so let me go to the next one because it continues directly on for that. You don't change things by fighting against an existing reality. Using the deceitful trick of what could be considered as true according to a theory of justice to distort the facts on the ground and enter into a world of reactionary racist promises and possessiveness crusades sanctified by the leadership of false prophets, who by the system can never be wrong when their fighting against reality causes worse outcomes for the people who need upliftment the most, while helping a few become a token aristocracy that emboldens the justice project that will drown the dignity of a people in toxic sympathy, which leads to the motivation to vile scapegoating and hate-mongering by a political oligarchy which controls and corrupts the economy, so it can't function naturally and provide the growth that in developing nations it is almost a given that the growth be produced. It's easy if you just don't mess it up, especially with the added help of a tax base, which we have had in this country. We have so many resources that other developing countries don't have. And they're using those resources effectively to focus on plunder and zero-sum redistribution and compensation for history instead of just having a progressive transformation. And other developing countries have performed better even without our tax base. If only we had intelligent policy that wasn't turning the state into a growth empty zone to conceal government greed with racialist politics and obsession with identity issues that are the politics of totalitarianism and ruthless and unaccountable government. But the people have chosen the ANC, which do these things, which have an assorted faction of EFF-style politics, driving the corrupt policies of identity that do not target disadvantage, but enrich middlemen instead of increasing a company's to increase a company's points. This is a typo. The points within the BEE system, but enrich middlemen instead, and focus on increasing companies' BEE point scores, and implode and weaken an economy that can sustainably grow. Sorry, that should be can't. That implode and weaken an economy that can't sustainably grow or even sustain itself against collapse. We really are kind of in the death spiral. And this is just I throw in some general points about South African politics. The DA is cleaning up its house and removing the corrupt ideology of identity from its politics. The DA are the alternative to the moral corruption that is the cause of state and economic corruption. Equality before the law and the rule of law principles are required to be in place for the law itself to not be a corruption. Chief Justice Mogoeng is a racialist and a destabilizing betrayer of the Constitution. He must be removed from his office. He says the inequality is worse since apartheid ended, and he only blames a past which includes nothing after 1994, an arbitrary date that suits his retributivist interpretation of transformation, and tells people to never stop talking about the past. In brackets, the past before apartheid, the past before apartheid and colonialism ended, and nothing after 1994. And to look at, he says people should never stop to look at who are the rich. Again, implicitly racializing and ignoring the new aristocracy that grow rich from state procurement and other deals, and mandated quotas of BEE point scoring, which destroy the fidelity of work credentials and create a toxic labor market, which is so poisonous that small businesses can't cope with the racial accounting and premium wages and headhunting that creates a perverse incentive that are not related to an operating functional market, creating a market of ideological consciousness instead that can only justify itself by repeating history lessons that we all already know and which are concealing new problems, talking about these history lessons, which are concealing new problems that are the proximate cause of our economy's sabotage. And he says people should stop polarizing politics. This is unreasonable hypocrisy and a distortion of how transformation is even effected according to the Constitution. In his explanation, he says people must know their rights to demand the treatment he describes, of being compensated through special treatments extracted from private entities to make up for the injustices of colonialism and apartheid. This is moral corruption, and it's poisonous to culture and to real development and progress. It's an unintelligent and retributivist solution which doesn't even work. If you want to tackle disadvantage, you create support to directly remove disadvantages from the equation, not this process of ignorant policy prejudice that assumes a never-ending procedure that drains all the life and possibility for a substantial measure of specific improvements to recipients' lives. Instead of handing out these general benefits that are gifted to a person's identity and makes them part of a racialist worldview of the kind peddled by war criminals in the making that preach a fake solution for fixing the problems we face in this country, imposing a collective guilt that helps divert political focus from mismanaged and dysfunction in the leadership of this country, all coming from the moral corruption of the law, betrayal of the Constitution, and the development of a collective guilt as a legally sanctioned argument, even by the Chief Justice, which does make him a war criminal in the making, and one of the authors of divisive and racialist politics in this country. Identity politics is premised on promulgating the idea of collective guilt, because it provides for collective compensation to the identity. That is the ideology of war criminals. There's no getting around it. If we had a more sophisticated international legal system, perhaps, I guess, this is why there was this move by the EFF preemptively to have us removed from the International Law Court, because at some point, when eventually this gets processed through culture and we see, unless at some point in the future of this country, in our history books, we talk about this part of our history in the new South Africa, where the Constitution was betrayed even by the Chief Justice, and when culture went crazy and adopted this fascistic worldview, unless we get to that point, I mean, the writing's on the wall. I mean, the writing's already on the wall. The question is, can we actually mobilize a proper response to it? And then I was sort of drafting this as a speech, as one might give in Parliament or something like that. And so I just said, God save this country and return the promise of the new South Africa. I pray God remove the EFF elements from this Parliament and the ruling party and the judiciary and save us from the spirit of the false prophet. Amen. And then I just made some other notes. A land audit of manufactured propaganda. So many delusionally tailored statistics that are shaped by corrupt political motives, not including the embarrassing assumptions used to guess people's races. We really should get back to classifying everyone's race into their ID numbers to help facilitate this new old South African form of race consciousness that has eclipsed and betrayed the new South Africa. For middlemen and an aristocracy of politically connected stooges, so that we can fall into the corrupt elite model of ruling states by out-group and in-group instead of facing and solving the issues of development. They have turned transformation into a new speak, as now the firemen and fish speakers will be let loose on me to secure the racist and proto-fascist legion of burgeoning war criminals. And then I just sort of give an example of for me it's the archetypal war criminal, which is the example that I always use. Quoted from public radio, this was on 702 and 567, Eusebius Makaiser said, if there was a genocide in this country, it wouldn't be unjustified. This is identity politics. This is its rationale. This is the logical line of the argument, and I'm going to get into that as to why effectively Cyril Ramaphosa keeps on being prodded to be more radical, because this is the logical extension of the line of the argument. And then I just retarded beliefs that the rich make the poor poor. If you believe that the rich make the poor to be poor, when it is the government who is not doing the job, when it is the government who is not doing its job, with the tax base which is predominantly provided by the rich, the failure in our state is the success of this new interpretation of the now betrayed reference to social justice in the Constitution. I mean, it is actually ironic, because social justice, as it's mentioned in the Constitution, has been literally inverted. It has been literally made its reverse. In the name of so-called social justice, we are literally contravening the protection that social justice is meant to provide in the Constitution by treating people as collective blocks of racialist, of their racialist essence, which is projected onto them by state power. It's disgusting. Demanding everyone worry about unity to enforce conformity with a disgusting ideology of sympathy in place of workability, while diverting from real problems that are sabotaging the future of this nation and its development, by implicit threat of violence involved in a disunity of compliance with the racialist new agenda of black oligarchy of a small elite at the cost of the many, under the cheap and convenient utilization of South Africa's unjust past, which cannot be equated to causing the current economic disparity. It certainly contributes to it. The past contributes to the current economic disparity, according to a hypothetical framework in which it's possible to reform the past, but it's not possible to reform the past. and attempting to alter the past instead of tackling how the conditions of the present instead of tackling the conditions of the present intelligently are not the same unless you buy into the racial idolatry which the Chief Justice and the EFF element of politics is poisoning the country with. Society doesn't tell you anything. That's just your narcissistic projections to make you feel like a superior moral being that deserves compensation for your identity vehicle of perceiving generalizations that feed your narcissism. Okay, that's just a general sort of standalone point on identity politics. You have a psychological issue with a political solution. It's also called a fascistic worldview. Stop looking at society as identity factions. The Nazis were just the liberal progressive echo chamber of identity politics of their time. Okay, so that's just sort of some standalone notes on identity politics, but there was something that I wanted to add to that thing that I was basically addressing to the Chief Justice. But yeah, I mean, in some sense, I don't complain about culture at large myself. I don't consider myself a hypocrite in that way. I mean, I'm commenting on culture, and if I find people that I feel like I can make some inroads with, then I'll engage with them and have an exchange. But I mean, to me, the legal system is the primary problem, because it is the legal system, and it is especially the Promotion of Equality Act, which has poisoned this culture. Because essentially, I do think that the form of the legal framework eventually molds culture, and we are reaping those rewards because we've given into this revenge kind of morality, and now we are essentially breeding monsters, war criminals in the making. And then I just made some points talking about feminism, but this is a complete quote. This was a response made to somebody else, and I just thought it was a decent opinion. Some woman who is in some college or something like that, some training thing, she wasn't being friends. She wasn't accepted into all the other women who were in a kind of clique or something like that. And I mean, I understand that I'm sort of making sort of conjecture, but I just said you shouldn't try to fit in with them. Toxic feminists, there are probably a clique of toxic feminists that are probably way in over their heads, and so compensating with their groupthink of judgmental narcissism to insulate their weak and immature and undeveloped characters. They are setting themselves up to go through their whole career screaming sexism at anyone who doesn't pander to their feeble, prestige-thirsty delusions of self-importance. Your first problem is wishing to fit in with toxic women, assuming that my diagnosis is correct. You should rather give them a wide berth and try make male friends. This will probably be better for you in the long run, and you can learn to be collegiate with men and learn the male way of advancement, which is based on performance, and develop your skills of working in groups with men so that you can actually learn a specialized skill which will make you a natural leader later in your career. Collaboration skills and communication so that you can get answers from people and develop your own knowledge base faster and be better at the work in general from these avenues will let you learn to spot the toxic female self-promoting autism that helps them use nonsense ideology to promote their grievance culture, which is only capable of being friends with people who have the same hollow strategy and people whom they can extract sympathy from, supplicating their disgusting by getting them to supplicate to their to offer supplication to their disgusting strategy. And then somebody else replied to me, the male way of advancement, which is based on performance. They quoted me, and then they said, and then my response to that was, yup, when males sponge, they are considered less masculine, and thus they have to conceal this, whereas women aren't diminished as women for doing this. And they even invented feminism to help normalize their substandard bullshit so that they can be proud at blaming their patriarchy for their deficiencies. And then they responded to me, advancement in male hierarchies often depends on much more than performance. And then I responded, what the fuck are male hierarchies? I'm not talking about male sports teams, I'm talking about the workplace, which are all mixed. Your weak and convenient thumbsuck generalizations, sorry, this is a bit profane, are dog shit that you use to validate your petty fascistic conception of society. Stop factionalizing people and talk about real traits. When you describe systems, it's just delusional projections from your narcissistic scar that keeps your narrative invulnerable to debunking. And then that's when I actually came up with the phrase, the Nazis were just the progressive liberal echo chamber of identity politics at their time. That is a point that I later elaborate on, is actually it is this invention of addressing a system that is actually the primary problem that we have in culture, is that people, they don't want to talk about people, they don't want to talk about other people in specific, and they don't want to talk about specific traits. They want to talk about the system as if it has some kind of control, some kind of pervasive top-down sort of point of contact. And so because it is this power, this all-powerful thing which depends on all these disgusting premises, like identity being the source of moral consideration and being the thing that everything is predicated on. So everything becomes a predicate in a kind of racialist essentialism. And then now I just made, these are all just notes that are separated, but there's some, they don't directly flow. So I've just got written here, think of the concept, privilege stigmatization is toxic. It's like making sustainable and economic advancement and better standards of morality impossible. All the complaining about violence against lesbianism would be better tackled by promoting the classical liberal point of view on private affairs. But this invasive expectation of identity politics that seeks to grab hold of a system and compel people into acceptance and compliance with the ideology of social justice, in brackets so-called, and that conception of society, by factionalizing society instead of by factionalizing society and obsessing about systems and hierarchy and culture instead of addressing real things which aren't projections, like traits that people have, traits of microaggressions and moral standards of political correctness, are foremost aimed at transforming the system. It's an obtuse and abstract treatment instead of dealing with the real constituent of society, people and those people's traits. The fundamental component of culture and people's traits, and that is the fundamental component of culture, which you can actually change, but you change it by engaging with people's traits as you deal with people directly, not dealing with the system. Trying to control the system of culture as a whole is to treat people with indignity and to project obligations onto people to validate the idea that systems rule people, instead of people's individual traits amounting to the cultural pool which is not an entity that can be made to dish out corrective compensation, nor should it, as that destroys both freedom of association, and the right for people to be persuaded within their own minds on their own terms, and which instead then merely abjectly treats them as a race designation or some other categorization which dehumanizes common humanity, because it breaks down how even communication works in terms of reasonableness and having this common value of reasonableness and communication. Now communication is even filtered and segmented into factionalism, which is just presumed and projected onto people. Sorry, this is slightly disjointed, but these are some ideas, I guess. We are manufacturing real racism by inventing this fake racialist complaining about history. When we already have a state which is tasked to tackle disadvantage, we cannot make this a mandatory regulation in business and put it upon private entities, as there aren't many employers who wouldn't try to be inspired by the spirit of the Constitution with the goal of enhancing equality. So I'm basically saying that people already would have goodwill to try to facilitate transformation, but mandates imposed by government, however, makes the use of discretion which would be needed when engaging in genuine upliftment, to go missing, which leads to unsustainable and toxic impositions on both workers and employers. Obviously, it would also be possible to be more experimental if we had more lax labor restrictions within probationary periods, but all rules have a tendency to being bent towards the unsustainable ideological demands of this new breed of racialist consciousness and its aftermath of inspired racism, caused by enforcing a racialist dogma which is reacted to instead of identifying the convoluted nature of its social poison and destruction of freedom of association and restriction on discretion in economic matters, which further create a dysfunctional labor market where black professionals are headhunted so as to destroy small businesses which are more fragile and reliant on their trained staff. Obviously, people are allowed to leave their jobs in search of higher earnings after they have acquired that valuable work experience from small business, but the premium on the labor of black professionals creates a bitter and toxic perverse incentive to rather avoid the sabotaged economic substrate to the economy, and its growth of sustainable opportunities is then lacking, which is what we live in. Listen to President Obama's speech that he gave on Mandela's Day. Look at Brexit even. There are two paths: breaking away from big regulation, which makes big business and big government naturally collude with corrupt designs that the entire population end up paying the costs of. We embrace an economy where small opportunities to compete and develop exist. We should embrace an economy where small opportunities to compete and develop exist. We need to choose the path before the debt of our nation leads to an ideological doubling down of the fascistic racialist rhetoric to scapegoat the failures of this corrupt political elite and those who stay in power because of its racialist views. Poisoning of the judiciary by the Chief Justice, rerouting Labour Court appeals to his special interpretations that would not look good under dual inspection of two higher courts, which require open discussion of judgments made before reasoning. I'm basically saying that if the appellate division had to look at labour matters and render a judgment, and then the Constitutional Court reviewed that judgment and had to issue a new judgment, it would have to at least respond to what the appellate division said, and there would be at least a more borne out rendering of this special interpretation that the Chief Justice is basically promulgating into our law. And so I'm basically saying that the reason why they have to circumvent the Labour Court effectively is because it's lunacy. Is because the legislation is wrong, and the legal theory is basically, I mean, it's that kind of legal positivism. You know, it already has developed into something that is going to be conducive to a more, I mean, we already live in that kind of fascistic culture that the law is pandering to openly. So I'm saying that the reasoning of this of these of now the Constitutional Court is being removed from having to that dialogue between the appellate division and itself is because its reasoning is not capable of any robust scrutiny, because it's based on double standards and hypocrisy and cherry-picked narrative crafting, like when the public protector found images of the famine in India to vilify Helen Ziller for tackling the hysteria and racialist prejudices leveled against whites because of history that was being treated in an unbalanced way. Lest we forget, for instance, the largest hospital in the world ever built was by apartheid. For those not and it was built for those who were not being given the full dignity that all people deserve, but they were not being given total apathy either. This does not make apartheid a positive thing. It means nothing. It means nothing is just of one quality. There is a diversity within experience. You know, nothing is just one thing. You know, it's a somewhat of a mixed bag, which was almost Helen Ziller's point. But you know, so yeah, you want to talk about the atrocities of the British in India in terms of colonialization, yes, you know, but I mean, can we, for example, look at, for instance, I think you can only, I mean, you know, history is a mixed bag. Experience, there's a huge diversity in history and experience. It's all a mixed bag. I mean, look at Hong Kong, for instance. Hong Kong, dare I say, is lucky to have been controlled by the British. Their political culture, the British political culture, the political sentiment, which is effectively a very large part of the liberal political values which our Constitution is premised in and dependent on. We wouldn't have those values. You know, you can say a lot about Ubuntu, but it doesn't quite, you know, or it just shows you that if you don't actually have the form of law that supports values, the values are dead. They're just window dressing. But I mean, which is actually quite exemplified by Hong Kong, because they're standing up for what on the face of it are not constitutional changes. They're changes, they're almost they're just pieces of legislation. They're just these individual pieces of legislation. It's not even, you know, so it just shows you how you have this corrupt seed in the law and how threatening it is to the ethos of a culture, and the corruption that it poses to freedom. Okay, and then okay, that's what I okay. So sorry, some of these notes are actually they're not fully elaborated, and they're not edited that well as well. But okay, let me just move on to the next one. Constantly selling society on the okay, so this is going back to the Chief Justice, because so commenting on him and the speech that he gave, which was reported on with all the quotes that he said in his speech. Constantly selling society on the importance of their propaganda for their special form of corrective and revenge bigotry. This includes even the Chief Justice, or he should be called the Unjustice, the Chief Unjustice. Okay, well, and there's also a tangent to be made on this point, although this is quite an obscure tangent, is that this sadly includes art and artists who are just putting political messages that echo the social justice narrative of glorifying generalizations and stereotypes about the system, which have little resonance with reality, as their level of analysis has nothing to do with people's actual traits. So they end up offering good examples of toxic projections thrown onto the system and categories of people in the name of in the name of a narcissistic scar that keeps the ideological narrative invulnerable to debunking, because of leveling profuse accusations to block any investigation of the so-called victimized group who gains the sole right to stereotype and mobilize prejudice. Because it's in the name of historical correction, because the prejudice is in the name of historical correction, which overlooks the challenges of repairing the ideological destruction from the groupthink into the present. Which overlooks the challenges of repairing the ideological. Oh, well, okay, that is slightly convoluted in my phrasing there, but basically what I'm saying is that it overlooks the challenges that it itself is making through its own ideological destruction. So it doesn't clean up its secondary toxic and poisonous effects from the ideological destruction caused by the groupthink that pollutes the present. So because of its fixation on the past, it's polluting the present with its groupthink that creates ideological destruction. Okay, cherry-picking their own statistical facts and reductions to solidify their claims, and an example of this would be Charlie's Angels, the latest Charlie's Angels reboot. It's hard enough to work with feminist actors. This is why talented writers and good stories are now told through Pixar and other animation houses, because actors were already difficult to work with without the weaponization of culture to feed into toxic vampirism. It also enforces a new form of tribalism, justice by tribal membership of identity categorization. If people want to claim against me for being provocative or something like that, or using strong language, I'll just say my justification essentially is the defense of the Constitution. And then I had some ideas about how to actually solve practical problems, but it's not really on topic. In terms of having more effective policing and having better management. The new tribal restriction of caring has led to destabilizing intervention on the economy. That has made opportunity scarce and backwards growth. Without a growing economy, class mobility is drastically depressed, and the EFF ideological answers, and that same element within the ruling party, uses the same wrong method of economic cannibalism, justified because it is some balanced revenge because of history of this country. This process is totally blind to the real issues. It destroys what it calls privilege instead of providing assistance that removes disadvantages and creates sustainable development. With a growing economy that provides more funds to remove even more disadvantage, okay, so that could be the alternative model. That is not only the intelligent way to progressively transform society, it's what the Constitution describes. Transformation obviously does not happen overnight, but with these backwards interpretations of social justice, it is making it impossible to ever arrive, except by the ultimate chapter of war crimes and more open forms of bigotry. Mandated racialist assignment of prescribed assets, perhaps looking over all those politically connected groups of cronies, the inequality of this new wave of selective care, tribalized care, and this removal of non-racialism from the law, and removal of equality before the law, and the removal of the rule of law itself, which is required to facilitate this new culture of special rights and special obligations through this new tribalism, has led to devastation of economic prospects, growing debt, and inefficient and ineffective management that sings its chorus only about the history of this country. Okay, now I've just got one more. Not one. Okay. But only the history before 1994 to continue to divert investigation into this corrupt state morality which is being propagated by the Chief Justice. If this country does not reform its ethics, it deserves the writing on the wall. The choice is clear: vote for identity politics or vote for pragmatic and sustainable growth. Hate speech that echoes this disgusting narrative is labeled as mere political commentary. Okay, so now I'm talking. I think I'm actually somewhat commenting on the story of Pravin Gordon, who was called a dog of white monopoly capital, and he tried to sue for hate speech the EFF for making that insult, and it was said that it did not contravene the Equality Act, I think, because he wasn't white effectively, so it wasn't hate speech against him, so it wasn't hate speech. And it was in fact political commentary according to the act. So anyway, hate speech that echoes this disgusting narrative is labeled as mere political commentary. And we see how fast all these transformation shortcuts really are, and this redefinition of progressive transformation to this new speak of a transformation ideology mouthed by our new revenge-driven legal theory, and where this has and where this shortcut has taken us. How much corruption, how much poisonous racialism of a reinvigorated racial imagination to make the world in the image of its idolatry and call it this new interpretation, and to call this idolatry. Sorry, I'm trying to edit my bad grammar on the fly. To make the world in the image of its idolatry and call this new interpretation equality of identity. To obsess over conspiracies of privilege so as to justify a reactionary racial privilege to balance with the system with the projections put onto groups and the system, with hideous stereotypes and generalizations which it judges individuals for in order to be blamed and in order to transfer the blame okay, they should have had a colon. generations with hideous stereotypes and generalizations, which it judges individuals for, in order for those individuals to be blamed and have hurt and injustice transferred back onto them according to the ideological vision, to vindicate the reaction of an unaccountable and hysterical demanding that never ceases to end the historical feud. It persists in this unaccountable procedure of scapegoating, and to which I can only, make the counterpoint: if you are at least going to blame the failing condition of this country on a group of people other than its government, you should have had the scapegoats belong to a separate voting process and have them be responsible for governance. Otherwise, this ideology of collective guilt is hypocritical, or at least inconsistent. So, I mean, it would be more consistent to just drop this whole general process of ideological revisionism of reality and filtering of reality and crazy interpretation of reality, or just get on with crowning a tyrant to sell you even more corrupt morality of endless unaccountability. How many people have had to leave this country to escape the destruction of this ideological filter and the parasitism of collective guilt and its toxic effects. Okay, I guess this is one of my more unfinished paragraphs. And I say something at the end about the electorate, which is left mid-sentence. That's perhaps a bit too harsh. I think that's why I abandoned that, because that line of reasoning was just a bit too blunt. When I say harsh, I mean blunt. I don't mean that it's untrue. I just mean that it's not effective rhetoric. The idea of innate moral deficiency based on group privilege, being male makes you innately right-wing, at least a little bit. This is a bit of an analogy. So you must atone for your collective guilt. Being white makes you even more innately right-wing, perhaps even ultra-right-wing, unless you are actively denigrating your race to help balance the generalization of possessiveness of each identity. This is all diversionary lunacy that works to promote vanity of identity by useless sympathy of accepting revenge and self-denigration in order to assuage a narcissistic form of so-called dignity, which turns people into racialist, obsessed idolaters of identity. Okay, that's a very nice standalone sort of point. There is a tradition of religiously minded people who stand up against fascistic idolatry of the identity. And then I just said, use Hong Kong analogy of helpful British political values. The average person in any society is not that interested in the details of politics. They follow the sources who they trust to supply opinion and commentary. Because of our culture being corrupted by identity politics, and that moral corruption has become in vogue by the groupthink that is supported as well by state authority and perversion of the legal theory, we have an ideological intelligentsia who are not actually capable of removing disgusting fascistic political figures from the den of snakes that politics has been surrendered to, with many parties towing these new moral lines of identity fixation. Musi Maimane is a exact example of such a well, and Cyril Ramaphosa, I guess, they both concede to the popularity of because I guess they're not principled first thinkers. They don't think from the ground up in terms of the far-reaching effects of this. They just think, oh yeah, that's a convenient tool to empower state, the state organs to be able to rule over the plebs, and destroy a liberal society, and to enforce a new creed of racialist values. It makes everything much more pliable. So here are some basic examples of where this identity politics thinking is just completely useless. So you have a problem like gender-based violence. So what is the solution? Shame all men. How long does it take to investigate an issue and give helpful advice and make useful heuristics of before unknown knowledge that increases the chances that informed people can avoid or identify the issue? Promulgating the idea that identity is the cause of all life experience and therefore trying to obligate the identity to conform to a narrative that's ideologically labeled as social justice, which in brackets I put quite ironic because of its debasement of the social justice in the Constitution, which is premised on non-racialism, which has been overtly betrayed. Okay, I guess I could have. I think I do get into this issue later on, but basically, you hear people on the radio and they say these really useless things where they ask these questions of all men, like these really puerile questions. It really is pathetic. The idea that someone who abuses women is going to hear that question and think, yeah, right, this question shames me, so I'm not going to abuse women anymore. I mean, it's fucking retarded. It doesn't get to the heart of the issue. It doesn't describe the issue. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually assist anyone. It just says that basically, if you're a woman, society is on your side, and we're going to do what? How are we actually going to help you? It's we're going to make you feel morally superior. Essentially, it's trying to ramp up sort of the dials of fear, and that is supposed to reduce a problematic event. Because we don't need to understand something. Are they actually really pathetically asking, oh, yeah, we don't understand why this is even happening? I mean, is it a real question because they want to know? I mean, no. I mean, obviously, the context of it is that the question itself is a form of activism. But, I know why it's actually happening, but anyway, I'm going to get into that point, probably not in the next thing, but I do talk about how this activism is. No, actually, I think I made a recording about it instead. I didn't write it down. Is this next paragraph too esoteric? I think it was just a kind of a proactive sort of attitude to try to weather this disgusting fascistic worldview and culture and factionalism. Be yourself, confront the slings of arrows without the power. Oh, no. Yeah, so I guess this is actually talking to people who believe in identity politics as saying, encouraging them to transition into not believing in identity politics effectively, and planning their life by it, and essentially getting into the self-sabotage that it kind of promotes in order to continue to use its defense mechanisms to solve all your problems. Be yourself, confront the slings of arrows without the power that identity could afford you, making your own allegiances. Sorry, I read that wrong. Confront the slings of arrows without the powers that identity could afford you, making your own, which would, if you did use identity, make you owe allegiance to that crutch that has its own indignity built into it, an indignity that requires a target to burden the guilt for the use of that identity power, which the narrative describes as necessary by its storytelling leadership, who have their actions cloaked as the invisible hand of a systemic balance and totalitarian moral authority, creating a permanent and unsustainable infantilism on the system that produces worse and worse inequality between politically connected and an ideological following that provides the precondition to a leadership that is representative of that identity. So you end up creating a leadership that is only representative of the identity, and everything is done in the name of the identity, and nothing much else happens but what is for the identity. And okay, now I'm getting onto Sir Ramaphosa directly in what he said. It was reported that the president said some very proper and decent comments on the topic of non-racialism at the same time that a white man was appointed to head ESCOM. That then he basically backpedaled all of these principled statements by implanting a defense of the Equality Act, which was a total non sequitur and hypocritical with the earlier principles that he stated. And it makes and he makes the libelous assumption that the only barrier to transformation is prejudiced views and racist sentiments, which he essentially advises is to be cured by imposing mandates and quotas, which he suggests be blindly followed, or else his condemnation for the lack of sensitivity in the form of racial consciousness means people are not inclusive and are bigots. This might even be more possible if the mandates weren't creating perverse incentives. My phrasing is bad here. I should rather say, this could somehow be possible if the mandates weren't creating perverse incentives and distortions in the labor market that now must be totally driven by this toxic racial consciousness, while the real barriers are never put into focus, as it's just so much easier to lump everything into a racialist narrative, into a racialist's narrative. The idea that in less than one full lifetime you can suddenly demand numbers in top management to be proportionate with the population. Has anyone even done a survey of the ages of those in top management? These statistics are pure propaganda, not to mention the racial profile or identity of management is not something that can be shaped by government regulation for obvious reasons. Managers need to command trust, and the toxic influence of quotas and mandates and a BEE point system that creates a distortion on salaries and black professionals government then is actually the main barrier to authentic transformation. They have destroyed the spirit of non-racialism and depressed the quality of management everywhere their influence has spread. Just look at the state of management in SOEs, by their disgusting and invasive racist program that is sabotaging the notion of trust and turning it into an ideological breeding ground for racial consciousness and black authoritarianism, which is a direct consequence of the unconditional Equality Act. Government must drastically redesign how it addresses the issues of transformation and the tackling of disadvantage without poisoning the natural operation of the labor market, which by itself would have led to far better outcomes than the jerry-rigged disaster of corruption of public morality, corruption of the law, and corruption of the very concept of integrity and trust. The trick is the government wants to be in command of transformation. It doesn't want to get involved with the issues, however. It doesn't want to get involved in any of the work involved. Other people must just get it done. This is complete inversion of the constitutional role described in the Equality Clause. Government has shifted its responsibility to private entities and has made itself a client of transformation while transferring, or rather scapegoating, any accountability for the outcome. All through the magic of this new racialist culture and enforced identity consciousness paradigm. It's disgusting. And what's more, it doesn't even work. Unless you count a failing and sabotaged economy working. And then I made a voice note specifically on the president and the judiciary, which and then I wrote here, I don't expect to be popular for telling the truth. A lot of people make money from these false racialist premises that are costing this country dearly in terms of lost opportunity while the situation gets more dire. So, and I say that because this is meant to somewhat be a speech, and you can imagine the kind of reaction that you would get if you said a speech like this in Parliament. You would imagine being, perhaps even being hounded by the Speaker. And to which, the only defense would really be is you would have to say, why do you say that, Mr. Speaker? Why do you say that? And you show the political subtext of whatever interference that there might be. And then if I were to say this in Parliament, I would even perhaps say things like this. President Ramaphosa's leadership is too weak to combat the moral corruption in his party and in the state and in the general culture. He won't keep his position if he declares war on such a great faction within his party and within the poison culture of identity fixation we all inhabit now, and which is maintained and promulgated by speeches from the Chief Justice. So I would rather the President not stand up and agree with me. And I don't think I'm capable of countenancing whatever condemnation he may concoct to dismiss my views. I think I would be driven to vacate this place and leave the termites to their feast. Let us rather directly engage between those demons and angels here, so let them say what they will and hash it out and leave the resulting consensus after the contest of ideas is had and that is left for the president to then echo. I'm willing to draw out these issues involved and debunk my opposition. Urgency point needs to be redrafted. The sooner we start doing the right things, the much less stress the re-gearing will be in order to get into a sustainable path that can afford to increase the benefits and grants that government dishes out. But for now, it must make these kinds of disbursements within a structure that seeks to remove people's dependency on the state. In business, you can't have someone's credentials be clouded by, okay, this is just going back onto the poison of the of BEE and such. In business, you can't have someone's credentials be clouded by a government mandate. There are maybe some industries that can absorb this kind of convoluted mandates and centrally and this generally centrally planned economy run by ideological filtering, but those will only by definition be jobs that have undifferentiated performance. You might as well mandate that the President of the Republic, who is not Indian and colored and white enough to be the president, because he must be at least 8% of this and 5% of that. If you don't meet this quota, then you're a hypocrite. Or you must concede that your quota system is a devastating blow to people's dignity and their intelligence. To juxtapose the current scapegoat with the prevailing identity politics orthodoxy, that's what I'm about to do. To juxtapose this the current scapegoat with the prevailing identity politics. There are many white people who are not smart enough to do certain jobs. They don't have their identity to help them achieve what they are not suited to do. And this is a good thing. Sometimes suitability is held back by other factors. These are the factors that affirmative action is meant to directly target with government policy. This kind of proper dispensation is not accomplished or addressed by simply mandating the private sector to address these issues without the authority or cultural backing to be allowed to tackle the components that make candidates unsuitable. Basically, I'm saying is that your employer can't tell you, you need to change this about yourself, and you need to go to do these things, because if an employer tells someone to do something like that, it's somewhat of a breach of certain labor strictures. But the government can say, you have been identified as being if you meet these standards that you would get the job, so let us give you what you need to qualify. And so we've designed these things that will get you up to speed, basically. And they might very well be not to do with work directly, but to do with other things. That are that have to do with disadvantage, that have to do with culture. So I'm just trying to find my place. Cultural backing to be allowed to tackle the components that make candidates unsuitable. In fact, the disruption caused by unsuitably placing candidates is now part of what identity politics regards as empowerment. And so the transformation is not progressive transformation, it's top-down imposition of a failing and substandard destabilization of common shared values that get negotiated organically, that would be negotiated organically within a free market, which objectively gives more room to those who invent better models that serve their customers. It is said in business, the customer is king, and there are even more customers in the informal market who deserve to choose which are the better businesses who are responsive to their interests. The winners and losers over time mean that you can't succeed if you cloud your business model with racism. Racism is bad for business. This is obvious, but it is not racist to oppose this invasive and superficial plan of transformation that is sabotaging the economy and failing the country. Distortion of reality by news selection bias. We hear sensational stories while the mundane imprecision and inappropriateness fostered by the racialist policy goes unreported, because it's too complicated for the simplistic narrative of identity politics to tolerate. and the huge wave of cultural orthodoxy, which is the spirit of the Führer, ruling over its identity supplicants and bullying those who will not condone its moral authority. In short, the description and sabotage that is wrought is concealed by this new racialist groupthink and its hyper and toxic racial consciousness. Colorblindness is replaced with new values of the fascistic worldview, which is uninterested in creating shared values and a shared exchange of sympathy and a shared exchange replaced by sympathy imposition, which then gets scapegoated on those who it is extracted from as responsible for this hideous process of moral degradation and large-scale failing on both an interpersonal and societal level, as war criminals are bred in this poisonous context. Why do I have written here voice note? Politics rant on dependency not being freedom, culture of flagrant moral corruption based on identity and irresponsibility. Yeah, so I think I was trying to talk about the dependency on dependency is not being free. Culture of flagrant moral corruption based on identity and irresponsibility because of the scapegoat of every issue on bigotry and insensitivity, trying to export failing OE model of management into a centrally planned economy based on a new racialism that breeds a toxic racialist consciousness to excuse the restriction of employment that comes from a displaced discretionary judgment and a culture of developing responsibility and accountability. So we don't develop those things. We just develop infantilism instead. Infantilism on the system that should be socially just, in inverted commas. Where identity politics makes this impossible, makes responsibility and accountability impossible, and the imposition distorts and devastates the labor market into an abject dysfunction that cannot create the right culture of management and leadership, as the moral corruption that policy is based both facilitates and promotes overt corruption. And then I worked out actually a good summary of how to describe these, what identity politics really is. You could call it identity scavenging. Identity scavengers who have no way of understanding the power of wealth creation because they have sabotaged wealth creation so thoroughly. Mentality and ideology on dependency on Big Brother, the mutation of constitutional law in the new South Africa. And obviously the psychological stress that the sort of causes, that sort of promotes the, they always say, oh, this country is so good for white people, this country. Well, then why are so many people leaving, And, you always have to ask, the overburden, do people have to be in South Africa to provide their tax money? They could go and be the same rate of productivity in some other country. They could be just as productive in some other country and pay less tax and not have to think, will this be the year that the poor attack the rich for the failings of the government, in line with the political propaganda and visions of identity scavengers like Julius Malema and the Chief Justice. I will have to include that video where I talk about how Cyril Ramaphosa essentially can't defend himself against the EFF politically because the EFF is actually following the line of argument that's in the law already. that's in it. What the law morally represents, if you follow the how that actually works intellectually, if you continue on that line of thinking, so that's why the president has to basically say these sorts of these sort of confused, self-refuting things. He will talk about non-racialism, and then in the next breath he will just completely savage it with this new speak, and it's just completely unprincipled. It just literally becomes window dressing. They've just labeled it non-racialism. This country will not succeed until it breaks its dependency on identity scavenging to soothe its racially premised self-esteem. But in the meantime, this ideology will continue to conceal and empower the corruption of the state and those who manage according to the spirit of this new culture of identity obsession, and the useless solutions given to that identity that enrich the well-connected and devastate the country, and conveniently scapegoat those who are the most productive for not succumbing to the centrally planned, racially mandated distortion of management and trust that is a vital component to any market, especially the labor market, which this government has poisoned with racialism instead of dispensations that target and solve disadvantages. It unconstitutionally passes the buck and does nothing that that people stop being racist according to this new definition of racism, making discretion and suitability and the role for government to target and deploy measures to facilitate the improvement of credentials of groups of disadvantaged people, not merely those who are so-called previously disadvantaged. And such people might be undeserving of special this continues in the brackets, because previously disadvantaged are such people that might not be deserving of special assistance by the state. Generalizations and stereotypes are the bread and butter of identity politics. There are many poor white people who are unsuited for high-paying professions and management roles. There is no need to confuse reasonable pragmatism with racism because it threatens the gravy train of the political plutocracy and the overregulation of the economy by government licenses and administration that empowers middlemen to redistribute money from consumers to a new unsustainable elite that degrades the reputation and integrity of business models to cater to racially premised parasitism. I think I said something similar in one of my other recordings, which actually articulates that point more fluidly. Might be a missing thing in that chain of reasoning, but the irrelevant. This is a fragmented point, but there is an irrelevant partitioning of reasoning to do with things, to do with what is unjust, in a way that doesn't even work for anyone but middlemen and politically connected elites, while creating a toxic culture of racialism to vindicate this new form of perpetrated injustice through state power in the name of a new speak of political correctness. Okay, sorry, this is all repeating itself. Identity politics is poisonous. It's using identity to scavenge self-esteem instead of having to live a life with accountability, projecting complaints against the system so you don't have to contend with the traits of real people and groups of people and plan your life accordingly. It's an excuse to self-sabotage and always be right, and demand Big Brother impose quotas and invasive right-think in order to vindicate the complaints against the system which other people are expected to be responsible for servicing and living up to. Basically, it's the ideological version of female privilege, because real equality through the conduit of non-sexism was probably going to start unraveling female privilege in the line with the height of modern morality, which was in the 1990s. So instead we have a fascistic conception of perpetual war between identity factions in order to insulate the toxic narcissism of a few borderline personality disordered women and men, but sadly, when these traits aren't culturally suppressed, they spread like a contagion. And so we've got this, society has become much more narcissistic because of this new tribalism, effectively, um, which is being directly instigated by people like the the Chief Justice, which really should be referred to as the Chief Unjustice, a betrayer of the Constitution, and one of the you know, God, I hope this gets into the history books as a schism, as a self-imposed, self-inflicted sabotage. And unless it is regarded as such, it's just going to it's just going to go the way of Zimbabwe. I mean, already, this kind of toxic rhetoric. I mean, Zimbabwe didn't actually, Robert Mugabe rather, didn't actually sanction the farm invasions until after they happened. He used the rhetoric. He kept on using this rhetoric, and then it inspired people to do it. And then after they did it, he couldn't disown them, and so he legalized it retroactively. And that is basically, the kind of climate that you get, as you're ramping up to Kristallnacht. And hopefully, there is enough time, there is enough pause, because we won the World Cup, perhaps, that there is enough time politically now for us to get a proper response to the villains that we have in politics, to the snakes. But we have to confront them, and we have to be willing to put up with the firestorm. We have to be willing also to admit when the rhetoric that we use is weak and missteps, and it's convoluted and it's hard to get into, and to deconstruct the fascistic worldview and the collective guilt and things like that, because it already when they start talking, they assume so much. They assume this racialist worldview. They assume identity as being the prime entity and and source of moral consideration. That people gain their moral consideration first from their identity and its historical narrative that comes packaged into it, and that's how they implant their that their mythologically based totalitarian moral authority, which effectively they've also infected the speaker with, because all of the EFFs performing in Parliament effectively and forcing the speaker to adopt rules to try and contain them, they now have these rules to be shaped and to be used to police hate speech, and things like that. And so, I think the culture is going to continue to weaponize itself unless it starts having authentic confrontation with it. It needs to be rebuked. It needs it needs a broad rebuttal need to be made point for point. We need to revivify non-racialism in this country, and it is very hard to do so because the framework has been corrupted. I mean, imagine fighting against apartheid during apartheid. That's essentially the kind of moral landscape that we have, but it's harder to do because the different treatment is not as overtly egregious, because it's not you can only live here and you can live there. It's much more subtle. The oppression is much more subtle, but the rhetoric is just as poisonous, and it is just a bit, well, it's perhaps even more likely to develop into Nazi Germany, effectively. because, you know, they can be as unaccountable as they like, effectively, and they're not the scapegoat, so it doesn't quite matter. Okay, anyway, I'm gonna end this.